Hello everyone. This evening, we're stepping into the ancient realm of Mesopotamia, a time when deities moved among mortals more closely than legend suggests, when urban centers emerged from barren desert landscapes, and when a single goddess held dominion over love, conflict, and humanity's destiny itself. Before we begin, please consider liking this video and subscribing if you truly appreciate these thorough examinations of ancient history and mythology. Share in the comments section where you're watching from and what captivates you about these timeless narratives. It's always intriguing to meet other enthusiasts of historical exploration. Lower your lights if possible, perhaps prepare a warm beverage, and let's begin this exploration together. This evening, we're doing more than simply recounting a tale. We're uncovering strata of human spiritual understanding that extend back over 5 millennia to a goddess whose identity resonated through sacred chambers and whose influence molded kingdoms. This chronicles Inanna, recognized by the Akkadians as Ishtar, a divine being so intricate and paradoxical that she resisted every effort by ancient religious scholars to classify her within simple boundaries. She stood as heaven's sovereign, the celestial body appearing at dawn and dusk, the mistress of combat, the foremost among peers, yet simultaneously the young woman who mourned her departed beloved. She never assumed the role of mother deity, never played the obedient spouse, never accepted a secondary position in anyone's celestial narrative. She claimed the spotlight, and for 3,000 years, the ancient civilization granted it to her. But what was her true nature? Where did her worship originate? And how did a goddess embodying such radical autonomy come to rule over one of history's most male-dominated societies? The emergence of the sovereign. Beginnings in the Uruk era. To grasp who Inanna truly was, we need to journey to the wetlands and marshes of southern Mesopotamia, to the 4th millennium before our Common Era, when the initial great urban centers were ascending from the fertile deposits between the Tigris and Euphrates waterways. This marked the Uruk period, designated after the metropolis that would become Inanna's principal sanctuary, a location the ancients identified as the inaugural city, the birthplace of civilization itself. Archaeological findings inform us that Inanna's veneration extends to roughly 4,000 to 3,100 before the Common Era, establishing her as among the most ancient deities we can identify with reasonable certainty. Her emblem, the star with 8 points, emerges on some of the most primitive clay documents containing any written form. These weren't yet narratives or religious compositions, merely administrative records, inventories of offerings presented to the sacred precinct. Yet even these ordinary documents disclose something significant. The goddess existed at the very inception, when humanity initially learned to preserve its concepts in lasting form. The designation Inanna probably originates from the Sumerian expression signifying Lady of the Heavens, although researchers continue debating this linguistic origin. The cuneiform symbol representing her identity doesn't seem to be a straightforward merger of the characters for Lady and Sky, which has prompted certain investigators to suggest that Inanna might have represented a goddess whose roots preceded the Sumerian divine assembly entirely, possibly a survival of some earlier Proto-Euphratean deity whose worship was integrated and modified by the Sumerians as they built their metropolitan civilization. Regardless of her beginnings, by the era we possess definitive written documentation, Inanna had already positioned herself as the guardian deity of Uruk. Among the most significant cities in early Mesopotamian chronology, the temple structure devoted to her bore the name Inanna, the dwelling of the heavens, a monumental architectural accomplishment that functioned not merely as a worship site, but as an economic center, administering extensive farming properties, overseeing commercial connections, and providing employment for hundreds of individuals, ranging from religious officials and priestesses to cultivators, artisans, and record keepers. In ancient Uruk documents, we learn that Inanna received worship in 3 separate manifestations, each reflecting a distinct dimension of her essence. There existed morning Inanna, connected with the planet Venus during its pre-sunrise appearance. There existed evening Inanna, the identical heavenly body manifesting after nightfall. and there existed princely Inanna, a form that appears to have highlighted her position as a divine sovereign. These three manifestations revealed the Sumerians' advanced celestial observations. They had determined that the morning and evening celestial bodies were identical, a comprehension level that numerous cultures wouldn't attain for generations. The association between Inanna and Venus transcended simple poetic comparison. Within the ancient Near Eastern perspective, the deities weren't disconnected from the physical realm but dwelled within it. Inanna represented Venus in an authentic sense. Her trajectories through the heavens, her vanishings and re-emergences, her luminosity that could surpass every other celestial entity, excluding the solar and lunar bodies. All of this was interpreted as the goddess herself, traversing the universe, executing her divine intentions. What were these intentions? Even in the most primitive documents, we encounter an Inanna distinguished by an almost unparalleled degree of self-determination and drive. She represented a goddess who energetically pursued expanding her realm of authority, who never felt satisfied with what had been allocated to her, who confronted the prevailing structure and insisted on more. In one incomplete narrative from this ancient era, we discover Inanna voicing discontent with her designated spheres, prompting her to pursue additional authorities through any available means. This leads us to an essential aspect about comprehending Inanna within Mesopotamian religious structure. The deities of Sumer, and subsequently of Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria, were arranged into what researchers term the Anunnaki, an expression signifying something similar to royal descendants or princely lineage. The Anunnaki comprised the supreme gods, the progeny of An, the celestial deity, and Ki, the terrestrial goddess. They were the divinities who determined humanity's destinies, who instituted the essential principles of existence, who preserved cosmic equilibrium. Inanna unquestionably belonged to the Anunnaki, one of the privileged deities who occupied the apex of divine authority. Ancient religious catalogues from the city of Shuruppak, extending to approximately 2600 before the Common Era, identify her as the third deity, positioned after solely An and Enlil, but preceding even Enki, the god of understanding. This position wasn't random. It mirrored authentic theological significance and cultic importance. Inanna commanded sanctuaries, religious orders, and devotion that matched any god in the assembly. Nevertheless, she also represented an anomaly among the Anunnaki. The majority of these supreme gods possessed distinctly defined domains of accountability. Enlil governed the atmosphere and served as the principal administrator of divine intention. Enki controlled the freshwater sources and held all understanding and mystical knowledge. Ninhursag was the mother of living beings. But Inanna, she represented contradictions. She presided over love, yet also over conflict. She delivered fertility, yet also devastation. She connected with morning brightness, yet descended into total darkness. She was honored for her intimate freedom, yet her principal narrative involved consigning her own spouse to mortality in the netherworld. The Sumerians didn't attempt resolving these contradictions. Rather, they appear to have welcomed them, recognizing that Inanna represented something essential about reality itself, the truth that existence encompasses both generation and annihilation, that affection and aggression are never as distant as we might prefer, that the energy that produces life is also closely tied with mortality. Early representations of Inanna from the Uruk period depict her accepting offerings from unclothed priests, her divine symbols, those characteristic reed clusters curved at the peak, positioned beside the entrance to her sanctuary. These depictions convey both the goddess's approachability. She was present, positioned at her temple entrance, and her transcendence, the complex ceremonies, and the nakedness of the priests, indicating the exposure necessary to approach the divine. As we examine these most ancient remnants of Inanna's worship, we're observing something extraordinary, the appearance of a goddess who would eventually represent the intricacies and paradoxes of metropolitan civilization itself. She received worship at the moment when humanity was executing perhaps its most basic transformation, From village-centered farming communities to authentic cities with all their accompanying splendors and terrors. And perhaps that explains why she never embodied a simple agricultural fertility goddess or an uncomplicated maternal figure. The cities she governed were locations of enormous innovation and equally enormous brutality, of unmatched prosperity and oppressive subjugation, of freedom from conventional restrictions and the establishment of new power structures. Inanna was the divine representation of this new metropolitan existence. She guaranteed satisfaction of longing, but required sacrifice. She provided security, but could revoke it impulsively. She was the goddess you required if you desired success in this new reality. But she was simultaneously the goddess who could obliterate you without hesitation. Family connections. The divine ancestry of the sovereign. Comprehending Inanna's position in the divine genealogy of ancient Mesopotamia illuminates much about how the Sumerians and their successors envisioned cosmic structure and divine governance. Yet this genealogy is far from straightforward or uniform. Various city-states, different historical periods, and different theological schools presented differing narratives of Inanna's parentage and connections, each version bearing its own implications regarding her authority and her place in heaven's hierarchy. The most prevalent and broadly recognized tradition in Sumerian documents identifies Inanna as the offspring of Nanna, also designated as Sin in Akkadian, the lunar god who served as the guardian deity of the city of Nanna himself was produced from the coupling of Enlil, the god of atmosphere and pantheon chief, and Ninlil, the mistress of the open heavens. Inanna's mother in this tradition was Ningal, whose designation translates to Great Mistress, a lunar goddess in her own capacity and the consort of Nanna. This lunar association is meaningful. The moon regulated temporal measurement in ancient Mesopotamia. Its phases marked the months. Its patterns governed religious observances and commercial activities. To be the lunar god's offspring was to possess a link to the fundamental patterns of being. Yet Inanna's connection with Venus, that brilliant, wandering celestial body, distinguished her from her father's constant, foreseeable cycles. Where Nanna delivered structure and consistency, Inanna delivered intensity and volatility. The combination of Nanna and Ningal as Inanna's parents appears reliably across varied sources. We encounter it in divine lists from the early dynastic era, around 2900 to 2350 before the Common Era, in hymns credited to the Third Dynasty of around 2112 to 2004 before the Common Era, and in subsequent Akkadian documents from Hattusa in Anatolia. One especially lovely hymn portrayed how Enlil and Ninlil themselves granted Inanna's authorities upon her, implying a type of divine consecration that awarded her exceptional standing among the gods. Nevertheless, alternative traditions existed, and these alternatives mirror authentic theological conflicts about Inanna's character and status, rather than simple scribal mistakes or provincial differences. Certain documents identify her as the offspring of An himself, the celestial god who occupied the absolute summit of the divine structure. This tradition surfaces less commonly than the Nanna parentage, but is documented in sufficient sources to be notable. If this were her parentage, it would position Inanna a generation senior in divine chronology, situating her among the most ancient deities rather than among their descendants, which might explain her remarkable independence and strength. The immediate offspring of heaven itself would possess few contemporaries who could contest her authority. Additional sources designate Enki as her father. Enki was the god of the subterranean freshwater ocean, the wellspring of all understanding, mystical power, and innovative force. He was the keeper of the me, those essential edicts of civilization that we'll investigate thoroughly subsequently. This tradition surfaces in particular literary documents where Enki is addressed as her father, though researchers observe that referring to a senior god as father could occasionally be a respectful designation rather than biological paternity. If Enki genuinely were her biological father, it would connect Inanna directly to the conveyance of culture and wisdom, establishing her as a central figure in delivering civilization to humanity. It would also render her connection with Enki, especially the renowned narrative in which she deceives him into relinquishing the me, significantly more intricate. What should we conclude from these rival genealogies? The most direct explanation is that Inanna's worship was exceptionally ancient and pervasive, and as various cities and different ruling dynasties ascended to dominance, they each attempted to integrate this formidable goddess into their own theological structures, modifying her familial connections to accommodate their regional pantheons and governmental requirements. But we might also perceive in these variations something more basic about how the Mesopotamians comprehended divinity itself. The gods weren't fixed, static beings, but rather living energies who could develop, transform, and assume new connections across time. What remains uniform across all these traditions is Inanna's connection with her twin sibling, Utu, designated as Shamash in Akkadian. Utu was the solar god, the deliverer of illumination, the observer of all matters, and most significantly, the god of fairness. Where daylight existed, nothing could remain concealed from Utu's omniscient observation. He observed pledges and penalized oath-breakers. He safeguarded wanderers and disclosed truth. The connection between Inanna and Utu was depicted as exceptionally intimate, perhaps even remarkably so. In numerous narratives, Utu emerges as Inanna's confidant, counselor, and guardian. When Inanna chooses to descend to the netherworld, it's Utu she consults. When she requires conveyance or aid in her various endeavors, it's frequently Utu she approaches. Certain contemporary researchers have remarked that the closeness of their connection, as depicted in particular love compositions and narratives, seems extraordinarily intense, prompting discussions about how such divine sibling relationships were interpreted in ancient Mesopotamia. While interpretations differ, what's beyond dispute is the special intimacy these two deities exhibited in the mythological documentation. Utu and Inanna represented complementary forces, his illumination that exposes all, her celestial body that gleams in both morning and evening, his fairness, systematic and relentless, her intensity, rapid and irresistible. They were twins in a universal sense, two dimensions of divine strength that were distinct yet profoundly interconnected. Less uncertain but equally significant was Inanna's connection with Ereshkigal, whose designation translates to sovereign of the great depths. If Inanna was heaven's sovereign, Ereshkigal was her shadowy counterpart, the governor of the netherworld, the territory of no return, the domain of dust and quietness, where all mortals ultimately must journey. The two goddesses virtually never emerged together in narratives outside of the celebrated descent, and they weren't catalogued near each other in divine inventories, indicating they inhabited entirely separate realms. In the descent narrative itself, Inanna addresses Ereshkigal as her elder sister, and this identification appears consistent in the sources where they interact. Yet researchers note that the Sumerians occasionally employ kinship designations like sister as a method to position deities on equivalent hierarchical planes, rather than signifying biological family connections. Whatever the exact character of their link, the relationship between these two formidable goddesses was unmistakably significant. It created a connection between the upper realm and the netherworld, between existence and mortality, between the productive earth above and the shadowy domain below. The two goddesses weren't adversaries precisely, but neither were they allies. They represented fundamentally distinct, frequently conflicting dimensions of being. When Inanna invaded Ereshkigal's territory in the descent narrative, it wasn't merely a journey to the netherworld, but a violation of cosmic limits, a defiance to the division between existence and mortality that couldn't remain unpunished. Completing the portrait of Inanna's immediate circle was Ninshubur, her sukal, or administrator. Ninshubur held a distinctive position in Inanna's mythology, a position that addresses the goddess's requirement for devoted assistance in her frequently hazardous ventures. In Sumerian documents, Ninshubur is depicted as female, a goddess in her own capacity who functioned as Inanna's nearest counselor, her courier, and her deliverer in moments of peril. The connection between them was one of reciprocal commitment and complete confidence. In certain documents, Ninshubur is catalogued immediately following Dumuzi, Inanna's spouse, in records of Inanna's divine circle. even preceding some of Inanna's blood relations. One lovely expression from the literature designates her ninshubur, cherished vizier. This devoted attendant would demonstrate essential in perhaps Inanna's most celebrated narrative, for it was Ninshubur who, adhering to Inanna's directives, pursued assistance from the supreme gods when Inanna didn't return from the netherworld, and it was through Ninshubur's determination that Inanna was ultimately rescued from mortality. Intriguingly, in subsequent Akkadian tradition, Ninshubur experienced a gender modification, becoming merged with the male deities Ilabrat and Papsukal, who functioned as couriers and administrators to the supreme gods. This transformation might indicate evolving cultural perspectives about suitable positions for female deities, or it might simply be a consequence of the intricate procedure by which Sumerian religious traditions were absorbed into Akkadian and subsequently Babylonian culture. This network of familial connections discloses something fundamental about Inanna's temperament and her position in Mesopotamian religion. She wasn't an isolated deity, but rather a goddess, situated in intricate networks of kinship, devotion, and divine governance. Her strength originated not merely from her own intense character, but from her associations with other notable deities. As Nanna's offspring, Utu's sibling, and Ereshkigal's sister, she bridged the domains of darkness, daylight, and mortality. As Enlil's granddaughter, she possessed the chief god's bloodline. As Anne's preferred, she held the celestial god's particular protection. Yet for all these associations, for all these formidable relatives and devoted servants, Inanna remained essentially independent in her character. She wasn't characterized by her connections to male gods in the manner that numerous goddesses were. She wasn't fundamentally a spouse or a mother. Her narratives don't focus on supporting or facilitating male champions. Instead, she was the central figure of her own chronicles, the propelling energy of her own fate, a goddess who employed her associations and connections as instruments to accomplish her own objectives rather than being characterized by them. This autonomous temperament would manifest most dramatically in the narratives that constitute the foundation of her worship. The chronicles of how she obtained authority, how she descended to the netherworld and emerged, how she managed affection and bereavement, triumph and failure. But supporting all these accounts was this foundation: a goddess produced by the moon, sibling to the sun, sovereign of the celestial bodies, accompanied by devoted servants, and connected by kinship bonds to the actual fabric of the universe itself. The territories of the sovereign, affection, conflict, and everything intermediate. To comprehend Inanna is to comprehend contradiction, or more accurately, to comprehend that what seems contradictory to us was, in the ancient Mesopotamian perspective, entirely logical. Inanna's dominion stretched over dimensions of being that we characteristically divide into separate classifications: affection and conflict, intimate relations and aggression, abundance and annihilation. But for the Sumerians and their cultural descendants, these weren't contrasts but rather distinct expressions of identical fundamental energies. Let's commence with affection, for this was possibly Inanna's most honored domain. She was the goddess of intimate love, amorous longing, bodily gratification, the energy that attracts bodies together and generates the rapture that surpasses ordinary being. Her connection with intimacy was neither reserved nor indirect. The Sumerians honored human intimacy as a divine gift, and Inanna represented that gift in its most powerful and transformative manifestation. In the collection of Sumerian love compositions, Inanna emerges as the supreme lover, audacious, fervent, unashamed of her longing. These compositions, extending primarily to the Ur dynasty era, around 2100 to 2000 before the Common Era, portray close encounters between the goddess and her beloved Dumuzi with exceptional candor. She extols her own form, likening her vulva to heaven's vessel, to a plot prepared for cultivation, to a crescent lunar body. She summons Dumuzi to her chamber, guarantees him gratification beyond conception, portrays the act of lovemaking itself, infaming metaphors that render the association between intimate coupling and terrestrial abundance explicit. But significantly, Inanna was never depicted as a spouse in the household sense. She wasn't the goddess of matrimony as an establishment or of the home as a social entity. She didn't weave or pulverize grain or nurture offspring. Rather, she represented the transformative strength of amorous affection itself, the longing that disrupts social structure, that propels individuals to relinquish caution, that generates temporary madness in which ordinary regulations don't apply. Her association to prostitution must be interpreted in this framework. Inanna was the guardian of prostitutes, not in a sense of subjugation, but in her representation of intimate autonomy unconstrained by matrimony or reproduction. In ancient Mesopotamia, particular classifications of priestesses connected with Inanna's sanctuaries participated in ceremonial intimacy. And while the precise character and scope of these customs remains disputed among researchers, what's evident is that intimacy in service to Inanna was perceived as sacred, as a method of accessing divine strength and favor. The gender-crossing dimensions of Inanna's worship further complicate straightforward classifications. Her sanctuaries employed the Gala priests, a classification of religious practitioners who executed lamentations in the Emessal dialect, a variety of Sumerian connected with feminine expression and who may have embraced feminine gender manifestations. The Asinu, another classification of Inanna's worshippers in Akkadian documents, wore feminine garments and executed combat dances in the goddess's sanctuaries. Multiple hymns portray Inanna as holding the capability to transform males into females and females into males. One exceptional Sumerian hymn declares, "To transform a male into a female and a female into a male, to alter one into the other. This is yours, Inanna." The presence of these gender-variant individuals within Inanna's worship, individuals who evidently held respected ceremonial positions, addresses the goddess's connection with violation and metamorphosis, her strength to traverse limits that others accepted as permanent and absolute. From affection and intimacy, we transition to conflict, and here, Inanna's temperament becomes possibly most foreign to contemporary sensibilities. She was a warrior goddess of frightening ferocity, guardian of monarchs and military leaders, the goddess you summoned before combat, the one whose manifestation on the battlefield signified triumph or devastating failure. In her warlike dimension, she was illustrated with weaponry emerging from her shoulders, occasionally wearing facial hair to highlight her masculine strength, positioned on a lion or with a lion beside her. The lion was her consecrated creature, and the connection was not coincidental. The lion's vocalization was likened to thunder, and Inanna herself was linked to tempests, to the brutal strength of nature that could deliver both life-sustaining precipitation and devastating obliteration. When Sumerian monarchs extolled Inanna in their victory records, they employed imagery of overwhelming brutality. She was portrayed as saturating the waterways with blood, causing the mountains to shake, making adversaries escape in horror before her. Sargon of Akkad, who established the initial empire in Mesopotamian chronology around 2334 before the Common Era, credited his military achievement directly to Inanna's patronage. His offspring, the priestess Enheduanna, composed some of the most ancient attributed poetry in human chronology, hymns to Inanna that emphasize the goddess's frightening strength in combat. In one celebrated passage, Enheduanna composes of how Inanna adorns herself with the garments of conflict, how she advances across the battlefield like a tempest, how none can resist her wrath. But why should affection and conflict be associated? Why should the identical goddess who governed intimate rapture also relish the carnage of combat? To the Mesopotamian consciousness, both were dimensions of overwhelming intensity. Both entailed the violation of ordinary limits. Both generated states of awareness in which typical regulations were suspended. In affection, as in conflict, individuals lost themselves, became something distinct from their everyday selves, accessed reserves of vigor and bravery they didn't ordinarily hold. More practically, both territories were fundamental to the operation of early Mesopotamian city-states. A city required abundance, intimate reproduction, farming, prosperity, and it also required military strength, the capability to protect itself and to extend force against competitors. A goddess who administered both was a goddess who could guarantee the city's survival and prosperity in every dimension. Monarchs asserted to be the spouse of Inanna precisely because this connection granted them access to both dimensions of her strength, the authorization that originated from sacred intimacy and the triumph that originated from divine patronage in combat. Inanna's third principal domain was abundance in the comprehensive farming sense. As goddess of the storage facility, she governed the harvest and the conservation of nourishment. The date palm was especially consecrated to her, and in ancient periods, she was connected with a god designated Dumuzi Galana, a deity of the date harvest who was subsequently merged with or supplanted by the shepherd god Dumuzi, who became her primary consort. The abundance she awarded was not the gentle, nurturing abundance of mother goddesses like Ninhursag. Inanna's abundance was intense, powerful, overwhelming. It was the abundance of midsummer, of completeness before the decline, of prosperity that approaches excess. The consecrated matrimony ceremony, which we'll investigate in greater detail subsequently, entailed the bodily coupling of the monarch with Inanna, represented by her high priestess, to guarantee the territory's abundance. This was not metaphorical. The ancients believed that this ceremonial act of intimacy genuinely rendered the plots abundant, delivered the precipitation, guaranteed the harvest. Beyond these principal domains, Inanna accumulated authorities and characteristics that rendered her among the most intricate figures in the complete Mesopotamian assembly. She was connected with governmental strength and divine fairness, collaborating alongside her sibling Utu to impose correct conduct and discipline wrongdoing. She was the guardian of prostitutes and taverns, locations in ancient civilization that existed somewhat outside ordinary social frameworks. She was attributed with mastery of music, movement, and all the disciplines of civilized existence. In her celestial manifestation, she was Venus, the morning and evening celestial body, the most luminous entity in the heavens, besides the solar and lunar bodies. Ancient astronomers had witnessed Venus's distinctive trajectories, how it vanished when it approached too near the sun, only to resurface on the contrary horizon. This vanishing and re-emergence would become essential to comprehending one of Inanna's central narratives, her descent to the netherworld. The planet's trajectories were perceived not as mechanical orbital mechanics, but as the goddess herself traversing the universe, vanishing into the domain of mortality, and then dramatically emerging to existence. This celestial association granted Inanna a universal dimension that transcended her terrestrial domains. She wasn't merely a goddess of human endeavors, but a heavenly strength whose trajectories regulated temporal progression and seasons. The intermittent manifestation of Venus, the reality that it appeared to be two distinct celestial bodies, until you recognized they were identical, reinforced Inanna's connection with dualities and metamorphoses. She was the morning celestial body that announced the solar body's ascension, connected with fresh commencements, and the evening celestial body that emerged after nightfall, connected with conclusions and transitions. By the apex of Sumerian civilization around 2100 before the Common Era, Inanna had become arguably the most significant goddess in Mesopotamia, conceivably the most significant deity of any gender. Her authorities and domains had broadened to include virtually every dimension of being that wasn't particularly claimed by other principal gods. She possessed sanctuaries across Sumer, from Uruk to Nippur to Ur to Lagash. Monarchs characterized themselves as her spouse. Priestesses possessed enormous social and commercial strength as her representatives on earth. Yet through all this accumulation of authority and worship significance, Inanna preserved her temperament as a goddess who refused to be tamed or restricted. Other deities possessed their designated realms and primarily remained within them. Enki administered the freshwater sources and understanding. Enlil governed the atmosphere and divine authority. Utu regulated fairness and illumination. But Inanna was perpetually reaching beyond whatever limits had been established for her, perpetually insisting on more, perpetually violating, perpetually surprising. She was formidable, not despite her contradictions, but because of them, because she represented the intricacy and volatility of being itself. This multidimensional character rendered her approachable to virtually anyone, Warriors could petition her for triumph. Lovers could summon her for intensity. Farmers required her for abundance. Politicians necessitated her for authorization. Outsiders and marginalized people could discover in her worship a location where conventional social structures were at least temporarily suspended. She was everything to everyone. Yet she remained irreducibly herself. The sovereign of heaven who yielded to no one, who established her own regulations, who descended into mortality itself and emerged victorious. The deceiver's acquisition, Inanna and the me of civilization. Among all of Inanna's narratives, possibly none better captures her temperament than the chronicle of how she obtained the me from Enki, the god of understanding. This is an account of drive, cleverness, enticement, and the conveyance of civilization itself, from one city to another, from one god to a goddess, who refused to acknowledge the restrictions others attempted to impose upon her. It's also a chronicle that discloses the Mesopotamian comprehension of how culture and wisdom operate, how they can be conveyed, appropriated, or acquired through astuteness. First, we must comprehend what the me actually were. The designation is typically left untranslated because there's no singular English term that captures the notion sufficiently. The me were edicts, authorities, establishments, technologies, and dimensions of civilization that permitted structured society to exist. Each me embodied one particular dimension of human culture. These ranged from abstract notions like truth, triumph, and counsel to technologies such as inscription and textile production, to social establishments like monarchy and priesthood, to moral classifications like fairness and deception. The me were not abstract principles, but rather tangible entities that could be preserved, exhibited, and most significantly conveyed from one deity to another. In the ancient perspective, for a god to hold a me signified that God possessed the divine authorization to grant that dimension of civilization upon humanity. The me were assembled and protected by Enki in his city of Eridu, the most ancient city in Sumerian tradition, the location where, according to narrative, monarchy initially descended from heaven. A principal source for the chronicle of Inanna's acquisition of the me is an extensive Sumerian composition extending to roughly the 3rd Dynasty era, around 2100 before the Common Era. The composition is designated in its Sumerian form Inanna and Enki, the conveyance of the disciplines of civilization from Eridu to Uruk. That designation informs us immediately what's at risk. This isn't merely a chronicle about one goddess obtaining some divine authorities. It's mythology, an explanation of how Uruk, Inanna's city, ascended to become the preeminent center of civilization in ancient Mesopotamia. The chronicle commences with Inanna choosing to visit Enki at his dwelling in Eridu. The document is explicit about her motivation. She desires to enhance the splendor of her own city. She recognizes that Enki holds something of essential significance, and she's determined to obtain it. The composition portrays her preparations for this journey. She adorns herself with the crown of the steppe, the royal emblem of sovereignty. She extols her own divine beauty. She speaks of her objective to reach the Abzu, the freshwater ocean beneath the earth where Enki resides, and explicitly declares her plan to speak charmingly to secure Enki's patronage. This isn't simply a goddess desiring to visit a relation. This is a calculated campaign of enticement and manipulation. Inanna comprehends the strength of her intimacy and her allure, and she's prepared to employ both to accomplish her objectives. The Mesopotamian audience, hearing this chronicle, would have recognized immediately what type of account they were experiencing. This was a deceiver chronicle, and Inanna was assuming the position of the astute champion who outwits a more formidable opponent through cunning rather than power. When Inanna arrives in Eridu, Enki, the god who supposedly comprehends all intentions and perceives all plans, welcomes her cordially. The document emphasizes Enki's understanding and foreknowledge, noting that he knew of her approach long before she arrived. Yet despite this supposed omniscience, he evidently didn't foresee what was about to occur. Or possibly he did, and was simply unable to resist the combination of Inanna's beauty and his own generosity. Enki instructs his servants to arrange a feast for the goddess. Butter cakes are to be presented, Sweet beer is to be dispensed. Cool water is to be supplied. This detail about the beer demonstrates essential. Enki and Inanna commence drinking together, participating in what the document depicts as a cordial conversation between two formidable deities. But as the beer flows, Enki becomes increasingly intoxicated, and in his inebriated condition, he commences relinquishing the me to Inanna. The composition catalogues these gifts in sets, and with each set, the pattern repeats. Enki, in his generosity or absence of discernment, presents Inanna some portion of the me. She acknowledges them. He presents more. She acknowledges those as well. The inventory of me that Enki relinquishes is comprehensive and includes some of the most essential dimensions of civilization. He grants her the crown, the throne, and the scepter, emblems of legitimate governance. He grants her the discipline of love-making and the position of prostitute. He grants her truth and deception, triumph and failure. He grants her judgment and decision. On and on, the inventory continues. More than 60 distinct me in the portions of document that survive, and researchers believe the original composition catalogued even more. What stands out about this catalogue is its scope and its ethical impartiality. Inanna obtains not merely beneficial characteristics, but also harmful ones. She acquires the discipline of compassion and also the discipline of candor. She acquires seniority, which inspires respect, but also hostility and the devastation of urban centers. The Mesopotamians comprehended that civilization encompassed both virtue and wickedness, that the energies that permitted human communities to thrive also permitted them to perpetrate atrocities. All of this constituted the human experience, and all of it was manifested in the me. The document depicts this conveyance in a somewhat humorous manner. Enki, inebriated and expansive, continues presenting more me, and Inanna, completely lucid, or at minimum lucid enough to recognize what's transpiring, continues acknowledging them. There's a ceremonial quality to the interactions, with formal expressions of bestowing and acceptance. But beneath the formality lies Enki's total absence of discernment and Inanna's ruthless manipulation of his intoxicated condition. Ultimately, Inanna has assembled all the me that Enki has granted her, and she loads them onto her vessel of heaven. This expression, the vessel of heaven, emerges throughout the document as a recurring metaphor. Certain researchers have proposed it references Inanna's vulva, interpreting the entire episode as possessing strong, intimate undertones. Whether or not we acknowledge that interpretation, the vessel is unmistakably Inanna's mechanism of conveying the me from Eridu to Uruk, her vehicle for accomplishing the conveyance of civilization itself. Inanna departs Eridu with her invaluable cargo, accompanied by her devoted administrator, Ninshuba, but then arrives the morning following. Enki regains sobriety. He surveys his divine residence and recognizes the me are absent. He summons his administrator, Isimud, and inquires where the me are. Isimud, who presumably had observed the entire drunken interaction, informs Enki that he granted them all to Inanna, who has already departed for Uruk. Enki's response is immediate and frantic. He cannot permit this conveyance to persist. The me were his accountability, his territory. He insists that Isimud pursue Inanna and recover the me before she reaches Uruk. But Inanna, cautioned perhaps by her acute awareness or by Ninshuba's attentiveness, has already gained substantial distance. Still, Enki is resolute. He dispatches wave after wave of supernatural beings to intercept her. The composition portrays 7 distinct encounters as Inanna advances up the waterways from Eridu toward Uruk. At each stopping location, creatures dispatched by Enki attempt to capture the vessel of heaven and reclaim the me. Each occasion, Ninshuba, Inanna's devoted administrator, succeeds in repelling the attackers. The document doesn't provide us comprehensive accounts of these confrontations, but it makes evident that it's Ninshuba's allegiance and competence that guarantee Inanna's achievement. There's something almost absurd about these repeated endeavors. Enki continues dispatching different beings, 50 giants of Eridu at one juncture, all the immense fish at another, various creatures at other occasions. Each assault fails. It's as though the document is declaring that once Inanna has legitimately obtained the me, even though Enki was too inebriated to comprehend what he was executing, the conveyance cannot be nullified. The me were gifts acknowledged in authentic faith, even if they were granted in drunken foolishness. Finally, Inanna arrives at Uruk. The composition portrays her victorious arrival at various entrances of the city. At each entrance, the populace celebrates. They comprehend that something momentous has transpired. Their goddess has delivered them, civilization itself has rendered their city the rightful center of culture and wisdom in Mesopotamia. The me are unloaded, exhibited, and presumably employed in rendering Uruk the most magnificent of cities. And what of Enki? The composition concludes with an extraordinary detail. After all the unsuccessful endeavors to recover the me, after acknowledging that Inanna has triumphantly completed her expedition, Enki reconciles with her. He dispatches a favorable farewell, essentially acknowledging defeat and accepting the new circumstances. This conclusion might astonish us. We might anticipate Enki to remain enraged, to perpetuate the conflict, to insist on the me's return. But the composition suggests instead that what has transpired was somehow appropriate, that perhaps Inanna was destined to possess the me all along, that Enki's drunken generosity was not entirely accidental, but rather a manifestation of some deeper divine plan. From a historical and governmental perspective, this narrative almost certainly mirrors an actual transformation in authority and distinction from Eridu to Uruk at some juncture in Sumerian chronology. Eridu was indeed the most ancient city in Sumerian tradition, the location where, according to their royal catalogues, monarchy initially descended from heaven. But by the era this narrative was documented in the Third Dynasty period, Uruk had become the predominant center, the largest and most influential city-state. The narrative could be interpreted as supplying a divine explanation for this historical transformation, rendering it not a matter of conquest or chance, but rather the outcome of Inanna's astuteness and resolve. From a theological perspective, the chronicle accomplishes something even more intriguing. It positions Inanna as holding the very foundations of civilization. When Mesopotamian monarchs asserted to govern by divine authorization, when priests justified their social positions, when scribes instructed inscription, when craftsmen practiced their occupations, all of these endeavors ultimately originated from the me that Inanna had obtained from Enki. This granted her worship enormous significance and authorization. She wasn't merely a goddess of affection or conflict, she was the goddess who rendered civilized existence achievable. The chronicle also discloses something about Inanna's approaches and temperament. She didn't assault Eridu and capture the me by force, though as a war goddess, she presumably could have attempted. She didn't plead with Enki for the me, or attempt to persuade him through rational argument that she merited them. Instead, she employed enticement, hospitality, and alcohol. She manipulated Enki's generosity and his weakness. She functioned like a deceiver, and in succeeding, she demonstrated a truth that the Mesopotamians clearly valued, that occasionally astuteness and allure accomplish what force and authorization cannot. This narrative, then, is not merely an entertaining chronicle about divine misconduct, though it certainly is entertaining. It's a contemplation on authority, on gender, on the conveyance of culture, and on the character of civilization itself. It informs us that the Mesopotamians comprehended their own culture as something that had been acquired, obtained through the audacious action of their guardian goddess. And it informs us that Inanna was not satisfied to passively obtain whatever authorities the male gods condescended to grant her. She ventured out and seized what she desired, and in accomplishing so, she moulded the destiny of her city and her populace into the shadows, the descent to the netherworld. If the acquisition of the me demonstrated Inanna at her most astute and victorious, the narrative of her descent to the netherworld discloses her at her most exposed and perhaps her most significant. This chronicle, preserved in both Sumerian and Akkadian versions, is among the most celebrated accounts from all of Mesopotamian literature, and it's also among the most intricate and enigmatic. It's a narrative that has been analysed as an allegory for the shifting seasons, as a ceremony for farming abundance, as a psychological expedition into the shadow self, and as a governmental declaration about the restrictions of divine authority. All of these analyses encompass elements of truth, yet the narrative remains irreducible to any singular interpretation. The chronicle commences simply enough. From the supreme heaven, she directed her consciousness toward the supreme below. These opening phrases, repeated multiple occasions in the Sumerian version for emphasis, establish immediately that something momentous and transgressive is about to transpire. Inanna, sovereign of heaven, has chosen to visit the netherworld, the domain governed by her sister Ereshkigal, the territory from which no one emerges. Why does she execute this choice? The document grants us an official justification. Inanna informs the gatekeeper that she has arrived to participate in the funeral ceremonies of Gugalana, the bull of heaven, who was Ereshkigal's spouse and who had been eliminated. This association between Gugalana and the bull of heaven that emerges in the Gilgamesh epic has been disputed by researchers, some perceiving them as the identical figure, while others remain uncertain due to limited textual evidence. If they are identical, this signifies Inanna was accountable for her brother-in-law's mortality, rendering her declared justification for visiting either extraordinarily audacious or a deliberate provocation. But researchers have long suspected this explanation is either incomplete or deliberately deceptive. Other passages in the narrative and the comprehensive context of Inanna's temperament suggest different motivations. Certain documents hint that Inanna has journeyed to the netherworld to extend her authority into that domain, to add governance of the deceased to her already impressive catalogue of territories. This interpretation aligns with her pattern of perpetually pursuing to expand her realm of authority. The 7 divine authorities represented by her garments and jewelry that she delivers with her certainly indicates she arrived prepared to assert dominion. Another interpretation focuses on Inanna's connection with Ereshkigal. Perhaps the visit concerns confronting her counterpart, facing the shadow self, encountering that dimension of the divine feminine that manages mortality, decomposition, and conclusions rather than with existence, development, and beginnings. From this perspective, which draws on psychological interpretations of narrative developed in the 20th century, the descent could be perceived as an expedition of self-revelation and integration. While such interpretations weren't available to the ancient Mesopotamians themselves, the document does support the interpretation that Inanna's encounter with Ereshkigal represents a convergence of contrasts. Whatever her authentic motivation, Inanna prepares meticulously for this hazardous venture. Before she departs, she grants comprehensive directives to her devoted administrator, Ninshubur, about what to execute if she fails to emerge. Ninshubur is to wait 3 days. If Inanna has not surfaced from the netherworld after that duration, Ninshubur is to make the circuit of the supreme gods pursuing assistance. She's to tear at her eyes, her mouth, and even her buttocks in ceremonial lamentation. She's to dress like a beggar and journey to the sanctuaries of Enlil, Nanna, and Enki, pleading with each of them to rescue Inanna from the netherworld. These directives prove essential to the chronicle's outcome, but they also disclose something significant about Inanna's temperament. She comprehends she's undertaking a terrible hazard. She grasps that Ereshkigal's domain operates by different regulations than the heavenly realm, regulations that even the sovereign of heaven may not be capable of overcoming. She's proceeding anyway, but she's established provisions for the possibility of failure. This is not reckless audacity, but rather calculated risk undertaking with a contingency plan. Inanna embarks on her expedition to the netherworld, advancing through the cities of Sumer, relinquishing her sanctuaries and her authorization in each location. This descent is both literal, journeying down into the earth where the netherworld lay, and symbolic, surrendering everything that renders her who she is. She traverses through the netherworld's outer territories and finally reaches its principal entrance, the gateway to the domain proper. At the entrance, she encounters Neti, the chief gatekeeper of the netherworld. She announces herself in the most elevated terms conceivable. She is the sovereign of heaven. She has arrived to observe the funeral ceremonies, and she insists on entry. Neti, unimpressed by her designations or her divine standing, journeys to report to his mistress, Ereshkigal, that Inanna is at the entrance insisting on admission. Ereshkigal's response to this information is revealing. She's not pleased. She's enraged and perhaps also alarmed. What is Inanna executing here? What does she desire? Ereshkigal comprehends immediately that her sister's manifestation in the netherworld is a threat, a defiance to her authorization. But she also recognizes that Inanna is technically within her entitlements to enter if she asserts to be participating in funeral ceremonies. So Ereshkigal devises a plan that will strip Inanna of her authority while technically observing the proper protocols. She instructs Neti to secure the 7 entrances of the netherworld. Then one by one, he is to open each entrance just sufficiently for Inanna to pass through, and at each entrance, he is to remove one of Inanna's royal garments, one of the me she had so meticulously assembled, one component of the divine authority that renders her who she is. Permit her to enter bowed low, Ereshkigal commands, stripped of authorization, naked before judgment. This stripping away transpires exactly as Ereshkigal instructed. At the first entrance, the crown of the step is removed from Inanna's head. She protests. What is this? Neti responds with the inexorable expression that will be repeated at each entrance. Silence, Inanna. The ways of the netherworld are flawless. They may not be contested. At the second entrance, her small lapis lazuli beads are extracted from her neck. At the third entrance, the double strand of beads from her chest. At the fourth entrance, the breastplate designated "Come Man Come," a designation that itself suggests both her intimacy and her command. At the fifth entrance, the gold ring from her wrist. At the sixth entrance, the lapis measuring rod and line, emblems of her authorization as judge. At the seventh and final entrance, the royal robe from her form. By the moment Inanna enters the throne chamber of Ereshkigal, she is completely naked and bowed low, stripped of every emblem of her divine authority and dominion. She is exposed in a manner we have never witnessed her before. The me that she obtained from Enki, the territories she accumulated, the worship of millions of worshippers. None of it matters here. In the domain of mortality, she possesses no more authority than any mortal soul. What transpires next is rapid and terrible. The Anunnaki, the 7 judges of the netherworld, surround Inanna. They deliver their judgment with a glance. The terrible eye of mortality that eliminates without mercy. Inanna is struck deceased. Her corpse is suspended on a hook on the wall, abandoned to decompose like a piece of flesh. The sovereign of heaven has been reduced to a corpse. The goddess of existence has become the ultimate victim of mortality. For 3 days and 3 nights, Inanna hangs deceased in the netherworld. Above, Ninchuba waits, counting the hours, hoping against hope that her mistress will emerge. When the 3 days elapse with no communication from Inanna, Ninchuba begins executing the directives she was granted. She tears at her face in mourning, dresses in tatters, and advances to the sanctuaries of the supreme gods. First, she journeys to Enlil, the chief of the gods. She pleads with him to intervene, to rescue Inanna from the netherworld, but Enlil refuses. His response is severe and unforgiving. Inanna craved the supreme below, he declares. She who obtains the me of the netherworld does not emerge. She journeyed where she should not have journeyed, and now she must confront the consequences. There will be no rescue from him. Ninchuba journeys next to Nanna, Inanna's own father, the lunar god. Surely he will assist his offspring. But Nanna's response is identical to Enlil's. She craved the supreme below. She must acknowledge what that signifies. I will not assist. 2 of the most formidable gods in the assembly have refused to intervene. They perceive Inanna's situation as merited, as the natural consequence of her violation. Finally, Ninchuba arrives at Enki, the god of understanding, the god from whom Inanna once astutely obtained the me. Enki's response is entirely different. He doesn't lecture about consequences or cosmic regulations. Instead, he immediately begins devising a rescue plan. Under his fingernails, Enki extracts dirt, fashioning two beings, the Kurgara and the Galatur, who are neither male nor female. He grants them the nourishment of existence and the water of existence, and dispatches them down to the netherworld with particular directives. These sexless beings are capable of entering the netherworld without being subjected to its regulations in quite the identical manner as gendered beings would be. They discover Ereshkigal in the midst of birth agonies, groaning and suffering. Certain versions suggest she's in labour, others that she's experiencing some type of cosmic agony. The Kurgara and the Galatur execute something simple but potent. They sympathise with her. They echo her groans. They share her anguish. They provide her the compassion that no one in the netherworld ever obtains. Moved by their empathy, Ereshkigal presents them a gift. Anything they desire. As Enki instructed, they request only for the corpse that hangs on the hook. Ereshkigal, bound by her word, grants them Inanna's body. They sprinkle it with the nourishment and water of existence, and Inanna revives. She has triumphantly emerged from mortality, the only deity who has ever accomplished this achievement. But there's a complication. The netherworld does not relinquish its residents easily. As Inanna prepares to depart, the Gala demons, the bailiffs of the netherworld, attach themselves to her. Someone must assume her place, they insist. The netherworld cannot be abandoned empty. Inanna must supply a substitute, someone living who will descend to replace her. Inanna surfaces from the netherworld, accompanied by these demons, and everywhere she journeys, they inquire if this person or that person should be seized as her substitute. They suggest Ninshuba, but Inanna refuses. Her devoted administrator mourned for her, adhered to her directives, preserved her existence. How could she compensate such allegiance with mortality? They suggest various other attendants and allies, and each occasion Inanna refuses, protecting those who had mourned her absence. Finally, they reach Uruk, Inanna's own city, and there they discover Dumuzi, Inanna's spouse, positioned on his throne, dressed in magnificent robes, evidently unconcerned by his wife's absence. He hasn't mourned. He hasn't altered his garments. He appears to have simply taken advantage of Inanna's disappearance to enjoy the privileges of governance without her. When Inanna witnesses this, her anger is terrible and immediate. Him, she declares, seize him. The Gala demons capture Dumuzi and commence dragging him toward the netherworld. What follows in the document is Dumuzi's desperate endeavour to escape, summoning various gods for assistance, transforming himself into different forms, attempting to flee his fate. His sister Geshtinana aids him, and ultimately a compromise is reached. Dumuzi will spend half the year in the netherworld, and Geshtinana will assume his place for the other half. This alternation of manifestation and absence, existence and mortality, explains the shifting seasons, the annual pattern of development and decline. The narrative of Inanna's descent is layered with interpretations that accumulate rather than exclude each other. Yes, it explains the seasons, the dying of vegetation in the hot, dry summer when Dumuzi is in the netherworld, and the return of development in spring when he surfaces. Yes, it dramatizes the planet Venus's disappearance from the heavens for multiple days during its inferior conjunction with the sun, followed by its reappearance. Yes, it positions Inanna as uniquely formidable, the only deity who has experienced mortality and emerged. But it also executes something more subtle and perhaps more significant. It demonstrates to us that even the sovereign of heaven possesses restrictions. Inanna's drive and authority, which served her so effectively in obtaining the me from Enki, signify nothing in the domain of mortality. The netherworld operates by different regulations that even divine standing cannot circumvent. Mortality is the supreme equalizer, the energy that reduces sovereign and beggar to the identical condition. Yet the narrative doesn't conclude with Inanna's humiliation or even with her rescue. It concludes with her executing a choice, selecting Dumuzi as her substitute, disciplining him for his failure to mourn, to care, to recognize what her absence should have signified. This choice has troubled interpreters for millennia. Is Inanna cruel and vindictive, sacrificing her own spouse because he failed to weep for her? Or is she enforcing a necessary cosmic equilibrium, recognizing that the territory requires a shepherd to die so that abundance can emerge? The Mesopotamians themselves appear to have held both perspectives simultaneously. They recounted the chronicle of Dumuzi's mortality with sympathy for him, depicting his desperate flight and his sister's allegiance. But they also instituted an annual mourning ceremony for Dumuzi, a midsummer observance where the populace lamented his absence and honored his eventual emergence. This ceremony was interpreted as fundamental for guaranteeing the abundance of the territory and the prosperity of the populace. In the conclusion, Inanna's descent is a chronicle about authority and its restrictions, about mortality and emergence, about the cost of drive and the character of connection. It's a chronicle that refuses easy morals or simple interpretations. Like Inanna herself, the narrative encompasses contradictions that can't be resolved, enigmas that can't be fully explained, and perhaps that's exactly as it should be. The most magnificent narratives don't answer our questions. They deepen them. The affection and bereavement of Dumuzi, the consecrated matrimony. The connection between Inanna and Dumuzi is among the most honored and intricate partnerships in all of Mesopotamian mythology. It's a connection depicted in love poetry of extraordinary closeness and intensity, ritualized in ceremonies that linked divine and royal authority, commemorated in observances that mourned bereavement and honored emergence, and ultimately characterized by tragedy. To comprehend this connection is to comprehend how the ancient Mesopotamians conceived of affection, abundance, monarchy, and the eternal pattern of existence and mortality. Dumuzi, whose designation translates to devoted son or authentic child, was originally a separate god connected with shepherds and the development of plants, especially the date palm. In the most ancient Sumerian tradition, he emerges as Dumuzi Ama Oshumgalana, a deity of the date harvest. Subsequent traditions merge this figure with Dumuzi, the shepherd, generating the god who would become Inanna's principal consort. The Sumerians connected him with spring, with the season when the territory was abundant and prosperous, when the flocks were producing lambs and milk, when everything developed and flourished. But summers in ancient Mesopotamia were brutal. The hot, dry months delivered mortality to much of the vegetation. The territory became parched and barren. This annual pattern of prosperity, followed by desolation, required explanation. And that explanation was discovered in the chronicle of Dumuzi's mortality, an annual descent to the netherworld. When Dumuzi was with Inanna in the realm above, the territory flourished. When he was imprisoned below, forced to serve Inanna's term in the domain of mortality, the territory suffered. The affection between Inanna and Dumuzi was honored in an extraordinary collection of Sumerian poetry that researchers designate the Dumuzi-Inanna love compositions. These compositions, extending primarily to the 3rd dynasty of and the Izin-Lhasa periods, roughly 2100 to 1800 before the Common Era, are among the most lovely and candid celebrations of amorous affection to survive from the ancient realm. They portray the courtship between the goddess and the shepherd god, their reciprocal longing, their consummation, and their matrimony. In these compositions, Inanna is depicted as youthful, lovely, aware of her authority and her desirability. She portrays her own form with unabashed pride, employing farming metaphors that tie her intimacy directly to the abundance of the territory. She likens her vulva to a horn, to a vessel, to a moist, well-irrigated plot ready for ploughing. She summons Dumuzi to plough her plot, to plant his seed in her ground. The intimate imagery is explicit and unmistakable, but it's also consecrated, depicting their coupling as both a personal joining and a cosmic occurrence that guarantees the continuation of existence itself. Dumuzi emerges in these compositions as ardent, devoted, occasionally hesitant, requiring encouragement from the goddess. He extols Inanna's breasts, which he likens to a plot bearing produce. He speaks of drinking from them as though from a cup of sweet milk. When they finally unite, The poetry portrays their coupling with joy and celebration as something that delivers gratification to the gods and favour to the territory. But this romantic portrait was complicated by the manner their connection was depicted in other narratives, especially in the Descent Chronicle. There, Dumuzi's failure to mourn Inanna led directly to his condemnation to the netherworld. This generated a paradox. How could the devoted lover of the love compositions be the identical, indifferent spouse who didn't care that his wife had deceased? Researchers have struggled with this contradiction, with some suggesting that the descent represents an unusual or subsequent version of their connection, while others perceive in the contradiction evidence of Inanna's intricate character, her capacity for both intense affection and merciless vengeance. The resolution, such as it is, arrived in the decree that Dumuzi would spend only half the year in the netherworld, with his sister Inanna assuming his place for the other half. This compromise signified that the connection between Inanna and Dumuzi was characterized by separation and reunion, by bereavement and rediscovery, by mourning and celebration. It was never a settled domestic partnership, but rather an affection chronicle played out across the limits of existence and mortality. This divine drama was not merely a chronicle to be recounted. It was ritually enacted in what researchers designate the consecrated matrimony, or hieros gamos, one of the most significant religious ceremonies in ancient Mesopotamia. In this ceremony, the monarch of the city, characteristically Uruk, but also other Sumerian cities, would ceremonially marry Inanna, represented by her high priestess. The objective of this ceremony was explicitly to guarantee the abundance of the territory and the prosperity of the populace. The ceremony entailed elaborate preparation and celebration. The monarch would prepare the matrimony chamber, a consecrated space established within Inanna's sanctuary or in a special structure designated the Gippar. The chamber was strewn with grasses and covered with fine linen. Nourishment and drink, especially sweet beer, were prepared. The high priestess, assuming the position of Inanna herself, would be bathed, anointed, and adorned with jewelry and fine garments. On the appointed day, which was typically during the New Year observance, the monarch would process to the sanctuary. Along the route, love compositions would be sung, numerous of them probably drawn from or inspired by the Dumuzi Inanna collection. When the monarch arrived, the priestess, as Inanna, would greet him at the entrance. They would exchange ceremonial words, and gifts would be presented. Then, in the climactic moment of the ceremony, the monarch and the priestess would enter the matrimony chamber and consummate the coupling. This act was not interpreted as merely symbolic. The ancient Mesopotamians believed that this ceremonial, intimate coupling genuinely affected the abundance of the territory. When the monarch, assuming the position of Dumuzi, united with the goddess, the energies of existence and development were activated. The plots would be fruitful, the flocks would multiply, the storehouses would be full. The act was cosmic renewal accomplished through consecrated intimacy. The reality of how this ceremony was actually practiced has been extensively disputed by researchers. In the late 20th century, certain investigators questioned whether it entailed literal, intimate intercourse or was executed through symbolic substitution, with a few even suggesting it might have been purely literary rather than an actual executed ceremony. However, the weight of evidence, including references in administrative documents, royal records portraying monarchs as the spouse of Inanna, and the construction of special matrimony chambers in sanctuaries, strongly suggests that some manifestation of this ceremony was indeed executed, at minimum in particular periods and cities. The exact character of what transpired probably varied across duration and location. The governmental dimensions of the consecrated matrimony were notable. By ritually marrying Inanna, monarchs asserted divine authorization for their governance. They weren't merely men who had captured authority through force or inherited it through familial associations. They were the chosen spouse of the goddess, the one she had selected to be her consort. This granted them a claim to dominion that transcended ordinary governmental justifications. Numerous rulers from the third dynasty of and subsequent periods characterized themselves explicitly as the spouse of Inanna in their royal records. But the consecrated matrimony also imposed obligations. The monarch who married Inanna assumed the position of Dumuzi, and Dumuzi's fate was to die and descend to the netherworld. This generated a tension in the ceremony. The monarch gained divine authorization and the guarantee of prosperity, but he also became connected with a god who was destined for mortality. Certain researchers have suggested that this connection may have influenced concepts of consecrated monarchy. The notion that the monarch might require to be ritually or actually sacrificed to guarantee the territory's abundance, though direct evidence for this practice in Mesopotamia is absent. The annual mourning for Dumuzi was another essential dimension of the worship. During the month that bore his designation, in the apex of summer, when the territory was dry and barren, the populace would participate in ceremonial lamentation. Women especially would weep for Dumuzi, singing compositions of mourning that portrayed his mortality, his descent to the netherworld, his separation from Inanna. These lamentations were not merely expressions of grief, but ceremonial actions believed to possess cosmic efficacy, assisting to guarantee that Dumuzi would ultimately emerge and deliver abundance back to the territory. The association between Dumuzi's worship and women's ceremonial lamentations was so strong that even the Hebrew Bible mentions it centuries subsequently. The book of Ezekiel portrays women in Jerusalem weeping for Tammuz, the Babylonian designation for Dumuzi, a practice that the prophet condemns as foreign idolatry, but that unmistakably possessed deep roots and wide appeal. In the conclusion, the connection between Inanna and Dumuzi represents one of the most intricate explorations of affection and authority in ancient literature. It's a connection that encompasses authentic intensity and genuine devotion as evidenced by the love poetry. It also encompasses betrayal, discipline, and bereavement as demonstrated in the narrative of the descent. It ties together human intimacy, farming abundance, royal authorization, and cosmic structure in a manner that renders them all dimensions of the identical fundamental reality. The ancient Mesopotamians didn't perceive these as contradictions, but rather as the complete truth about affection and existence. Affection delivers joy and rapture, but it also delivers exposure and the potential for devastating bereavement. Abundance and development require mortality and decomposition. Authority gained through divine patronage arrives with divine expectations and divine disciplines for failure. All of this was embodied in the goddess and her consort, in their coupling and separation, in their affection and their bereavement, in the eternal pattern that delivered spring and summer, development and drought, existence and mortality, year after year across the Mesopotamian plain. The rejected goddess. Gilgamesh and the Bull of Heaven. Among the numerous narratives involving Inanna, one stands out for its depiction of divine wrath and human defiance. The chronicle of how the champion Gilgamesh rejected the goddess's advances and suffered terrible consequences. This account, discovered in both early Sumerian versions and the subsequent more celebrated standard Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, discloses a darker dimension of Inanna's temperament, her capacity for vindictiveness when scorned, and it raises significant questions about the connection between gods and mortals, divine longing and human autonomy. The setting is Uruk, Inanna's own city, where Gilgamesh governs as monarch. Gilgamesh, semi-divine himself as the son of the goddess Ninsun and the mortal monarch Lugalbanda, has just emerged from a great adventure. He and his companion Enkidu have journeyed to the cedar forest, battled and defeated the frightening guardian Humbabar, and emerged home victorious. Gilgamesh is at the apex of his authority and splendor, a champion honored throughout the territory. It's at this moment of triumph that the goddess Ishtar, as she's designated in the Akkadian version, notices him. She witnesses him washing away the filth of combat, putting on clean robes, adorning himself as befits a victorious monarch. His beauty captures her eye, and she's struck with longing. Being a goddess, she doesn't hesitate to act on that longing. She approaches Gilgamesh directly and propositions him, presenting to become his lover and showering him with guarantees of what she can supply. The speech Ishtar delivers to Gilgamesh is extraordinary for its generosity and its endeavors at enticement. She presents him a chariot of lapis lazuli and gold, with wheels of gold and horns of amber, She guarantees that tempest demons will be yoked as mules to pull it. She informs him that when he enters her dwelling, it will smell of cedar. She declares that people of significance will bow before him, that monarchs and princes will deliver him tribute, that his goats will bear triplets and his ewes twins, that his donkeys will be unequalled, that his chariot horses will be celebrated for their swiftness. These are not minor presentations. Ishtar is guaranteeing Gilgamesh prosperity, authority, distinction, and farming prosperity. She's presenting him everything a Mesopotamian monarch could desire, and significantly, she's presenting herself, the goddess of affection and conflict, the sovereign of heaven. To be the consort of Ishtar would grant Gilgamesh divine authorization that few mortals could assert. It would position him in the company of all those monarchs who had ritually married Inanna through the consecrated matrimony ceremony. But Gilgamesh refuses. His rejection is not courteous or gentle. It's brutal, insulting, and comprehensive. He questions what he would gain from matrimony to her, pointing out that she's a goddess who requires constant maintenance, like a door that doesn't keep out wind, a palace that crushes warriors, pitch that stains its bearer, a water skin that soaks its carrier. These are not compliments. Then Gilgamesh executes something even more damaging. He catalogues Ishtar's previous lovers and lists the terrible fates each of them suffered at her hands. He designates Dumuzi, her spouse, for whom she instituted lamentations year after year. He mentions the numerous-coloured roller bird, whose wing she broke so that it could no longer fly. He speaks of the lion, flawless in strength, for whom she excavated 7 and 7 pits. He tells of the horse she adored, for whom she instituted whip, goad, and lash. He designates the shepherd who baked bread for her constantly, yet whom she struck and transformed into a wolf. He recalls her father's gardener, Ishulanu, who delivered her baskets of dates regularly, and whom she struck and transformed into a frog when he rejected her advances. The litany continues. Gilgamesh is essentially designating Ishtar a serial abuser of her lovers, someone who obliterates everyone who approaches close to her. And then he inquires rhetorically and insultingly why he would desire to become another entry in this catalogue of ruined men. It's an exceptional speech, one that defies divine authorization and divine temperament in the most direct manner conceivable. Ishtar's response is exactly what we might anticipate. She's furious. She ascends to heaven immediately and complains to her parents, Anu and Antu. She insists that Anu grant her the bull of heaven so that she can discipline Gilgamesh for his affronts. And here's where we witness Ishtar at perhaps her most alarming. When Anu hesitates, voicing concern about the damage the bull will inflict, Ishtar delivers a threat that discloses the scope of her authority and her readiness to employ it. She threatens to demolish the entrances of the netherworld and resurrect the deceased to consume the living. She will render the deceased more plentiful than the living, she guarantees. This is apocalyptic imagery, a threat to obliterate the essential structure of being, to violate the limit between existence and mortality itself. It's also a threat that demonstrates Ishtar's close association to the netherworld, her connection with her sister Ereshkigal, and her authority over the domain of mortality, even though she doesn't govern there. Confronted with this threat, Anu relents. He grants Ishtar the bull of heaven, cautioning her first about the devastation it will inflict. He informs her there will be 7 years of scarcity if the bull is unleashed, inquiring if she has preserved sufficient grain to nourish the populace through this calamity. Ishtar confirms she has executed all necessary preparations, though the document grants us no justification to believe this is actually accurate. She desires retribution, and she's prepared to acknowledge whatever collateral damage that vengeance might necessitate. The bull of heaven descends to Uruk, and the devastation is immediate and catastrophic. With its first exhalation, it opens a massive pit in the ground, and 100 men plummet into it and perish. With its second exhalation, another pit opens, consuming 200 more men. The bull is an energy of natural calamity given form, an earthquake rendered manifest, a supernatural weapon that eliminates indiscriminately. But Gilgamesh and Enkidu are champions, and they don't escape. When the bull exhales a third occasion, Enkidu plummets into the pit but succeeds in leaping out again. He captures the bull by its horns and tail, and Gilgamesh, grasping the opportunity, thrusts his sword between the bull's shoulders, directly into its heart. The bull of heaven is defeated. The champions have triumphed over divine retribution. What transpires next depends on which version of the chronicle we're examining. In the Sumerian version, Gilgamesh is the one who hurls a haunch of the deceased bull at Inanna, who has been observing the confrontation from the city walls. In the standard Babylonian epic, it's Enkidu who perpetrates this sacrilege, tearing off the bull's thigh and throwing it in Ishtar's face, shouting that if he could capture her, he would execute the identical to her. This is an inexcusable affront, a physical assault on a goddess, rendered worse by the reality that it's executed in front of a gathering crowd. Ishtar responds by summoning together the courtesans, prostitutes, and harlots of the city, her worshippers, and instructing them to mourn for the bull of heaven. Meanwhile, Gilgamesh holds a triumph celebration, distributing portions of the bull and boasting of the triumph. But divine affronts don't remain unpunished. The gods convene a council to discuss what must be executed about these presumptuous champions who have eliminated the bull of heaven and affronted the goddess Ishtar. The decision they reach is that one of the two must die as discipline. They select Enkidu. In the tragic 7th and 8th tablets of the Epic of Gilgamesh, Enkidu falls sick, dreams of the netherworld, and dies, leaving Gilgamesh devastated and forcing him to confront his own mortality. This narrative functions on multiple dimensions. On the surface, it's a chronicle about divine petulance and human bravery. Gilgamesh possesses valid justifications to reject Ishtar, given her track record with previous lovers, and he's courageous enough to confront the consequences of that rejection. The bull of heaven is defeated through the champion's strength and collaboration. And though Enkidu ultimately pays with his existence, the immediate threat is overcome. But on a deeper dimension, this narrative concerns the restrictions of mortal autonomy in confronting divine intention. Gilgamesh, despite being semi-divine himself, despite being the monarch of Uruk and governing over Ishtar's city, cannot simply reject the goddess without consequences. His refusal might be justified, might even be prudent given Ishtar's chronology, but it disrupts the anticipated structure of matters. The goddess has delivered a presentation. For a mortal to refuse, especially in such affronting terms, is to defy divine authorization itself. The narrative also discloses uncomfortable truths about Ishtar's temperament that the love poetry and consecrated matrimony ceremonies tend to gloss over. Gilgamesh's catalogue of her abused lovers might be exaggerated or selective, but it's not entirely fabricated. The narratives do recount of Dumuzi's terrible fate. The chronicles do demonstrate Ishtar as volatile, fervent, rapid to anger, and capable of inflicting terrible disciplines on those who displease her. She's not a safe goddess, not someone you can easily manage or anticipate. Yet the narrative doesn't entirely vilify Ishtar either. From her perspective, she's delivered a generous presentation and been encountered with deliberate affronts. She's presented her patronage to Gilgamesh, something that countless monarchs would have eliminated for, and he's responded by publicly humiliating her. Her anger is perhaps excessive, her retribution disproportionate, but it's not incomprehensible. And the gods ultimately do discipline the champions for eliminating the bull and affronting the goddess, indicating that even they recognize that Gilgamesh and Enkidu had proceeded too far. The chronicle of Gilgamesh and Ishtar thus becomes a contemplation on longing, rejection, authority, and consequence. It demonstrates to us a goddess who is accustomed to obtaining what she desires, who perceives mortal monarchs as appropriate consorts, who anticipates her advances to be welcomed. It demonstrates to us a champion who is sufficiently formidable and autonomous to declare no to a goddess, to hazard her wrath in defense of his autonomy. And it demonstrates to us that such defiance, however justified, arrives at a terrible cost. For the populace of Uruk, who worshipped Ishtar as their guardian goddess, while also honouring Gilgamesh as their most magnificent champion, This narrative must have generated an intricate emotional and theological response. How do you honor both the goddess who insists on devotion and the champion who possessed the bravery to refuse her? Perhaps the answer is that you recognize both truths simultaneously, that Ishtar merits worship and respect, and that Gilgamesh's rejection, while costly, was also an assertion of human dignity in confronting divine caprice. The dwellings of heaven, sanctuaries and worship of the sovereign. To comprehend Inanna's position in Mesopotamian civilization, we must transition from narrative to worship, from chronicles recounted to ceremonies executed, from divine adventures to terrestrial sanctuaries. For Inanna was not merely a character in ancient literature, but a living manifestation in the cities of Sumer and Akkad, a goddess who insisted on worship, who obtained offerings, whose sanctuaries constituted the commercial and spiritual centers of metropolitan existence. The architecture and administration of these sanctuaries, the practices of her priesthood, the observances honored in her name, all of this informs us how the ancient Mesopotamians actually participated with this formidable and intricate deity. The most significant of all Inanna's sanctuaries was the Inanna in Uruk, the dwelling of heaven, which functioned as her principal worship center from the most ancient periods of Sumerian civilization through the conclusion of the Neo-Babylonian period, a duration of more than 3,000 years. The very designation proclaimed its cosmic significance. This was not merely a dwelling for a god, but a dwelling that represented heaven itself, a location where the divine and terrestrial domains intersected. Archaeological excavation of the Inanna complex has disclosed multiple construction phases, stretching back to the Uruk period of the late 4th millennium before the Common Era. The most ancient strata, extending to around 3,500 to 3,000 before the Common Era, demonstrate massive architectural undertakings. Buildings, constructed on enormous platforms decorated with elaborate mosaics, fabricated from colored stone cones pressed into mud plaster. These decorations generated geometric patterns that would have shimmered in the brilliant Mesopotamian sun, marking the sanctuary as something otherworldly, a dwelling suitable for the sovereign of heaven. Among the most celebrated artifacts connected with early Inanna worship is the Uruk vase, a magnificent carved alabaster vessel standing over 3 feet tall, extending to approximately 3,200 before the Common Era. This vase illustrates what emerges to be the ceremony of the consecrated matrimony, or perhaps a general sanctuary offering scene. The bottom register demonstrates plants and creatures, the farming prosperity that sustained the city. The middle register demonstrates naked men carrying baskets and vessels of offerings. The top register demonstrates what researchers interpret as a presentation of offerings to Inanna herself or to her high priestess at the entrance of the sanctuary, positioned beside her distinctive reed bundle standards. This vase grants us a glimpse into the most ancient period of Inanna's worship, demonstrating the sanctuary as the recipient of the community's farming surplus, demonstrating nude priests, suggesting ceremonial purity and exposure before the divine, demonstrating the goddess or her representative as the focus of community devotion and the center of redistributive commercial activity. The Inanna complex was more than a location of worship. It was a commercial powerhouse that administered vast properties, controlled commercial networks, employed hundreds of individuals, from administrators and scribes to cultivators and laborers. Clay tablets discovered in the sanctuary archives document transactions involving grain, livestock, textiles, and other commodities. The sanctuary assembled tithes and offerings, redistributed resources, compensated workers, and funded construction endeavors. In a genuine sense, the sanctuary of Inanna was the commercial engine that rendered metropolitan civilization achievable. This dual function, spiritual center and commercial establishment, was not perceived as contradictory. The prosperity of the territory originated from the goddess's patronage. Offerings delivered to her sanctuary were investments in the community's future, guaranteeing abundance and prosperity. The sanctuary's accumulation of prosperity was not exploitation, but rather a manifestation of divine favor that benefited everyone through the sanctuary's redistributive activities. The sanctuary was staffed by an intricate hierarchy of religious personnel. At the summit were high priestesses, women of privileged families, occasionally even of royal bloodline. The position of On, or high priestess, was one of enormous distinction and authority. These women represented Inanna in ceremonial contexts, especially in the consecrated matrimony ceremony. They were literate, educated, frequently politically influential. The most celebrated of all Sumerian high priestesses was Enki, offspring of Sargon of Akkad, who functioned as high priestess of Inanna at Ur, who composed hymns and compositions that are among the most ancient attributed literary works in human chronology. Below the high priestesses were various grades of priestesses with different ceremonial accountabilities. Certain were particularly connected with intimate ceremony or consecrated prostitution, the exact character of which remains disputed, but which unmistakably linked Inanna's position as goddess of intimacy with sanctuary service. These women were not stigmatized but rather honored as worshippers of the goddess who rendered their forms available in consecrated service. But Inanna's sanctuaries also employed male priests, including the distinctive gala priests who executed lamentations and who were connected with gender ambiguity or gender crossing. The gala employed the Emisal dialect, a variety of Sumerian especially connected with feminine expression and with the expression of gods in particular ceremonial contexts. They sang compositions of mourning, especially during the annual lamentations for Dumuzi. Their gender presentation, which appears to have entailed adopting feminine characteristics, was interpreted as component of their devotional service to a goddess who herself crossed limits and who possessed the authority to alter gender. The Asinu mentioned in Akkadian documents were another classification of gender-variant worshippers connected with Ishtar. They wore feminine garments, executed ceremonial movements, and were portrayed in documents as having been transformed by the goddess. Certain Akkadian proverbs suggest they may have participated in same-gender connections. Rather than being marginalized, these individuals held respected positions within the worship, their violation of ordinary gender classifications reflecting the goddess's own liminal character. The daily routine of the sanctuary entailed multiple offerings throughout the day. Morning offerings greeted the goddess as she awakened, conceptualizing the divine statue as a living being who required nourishment, drink, garments, and attention. Midday and evening offerings followed. The offerings included bread, beer, flesh, oil, and other foodstuffs, as well as incense to purify the consecrated space. These offerings were not merely symbolic. The nourishment was authentic, and after being presented to the goddess, it would be redistributed to the sanctuary personnel, a system that employed and nourished a substantial portion of the metropolitan populace. Beyond daily offerings, Inanna's worship featured numerous observances throughout the year. The most significant was connected with the New Year, when the consecrated matrimony was executed. This multi-day celebration entailed processions, feasting, music, movement, and ceremonial drama. The monarch would process to the sanctuary, hymns would be sung, the matrimony chamber would be prepared, and the ceremonial coupling would be consummated, guaranteeing abundance for the approaching year. The observance of Dumuzi's lamentation occurred in midsummer during the month bearing his designation. This was a duration of mourning when women especially would weep for the lost god, singing compositions that portrayed his mortality and his separation from Inanna. This mourning was not mere sorrow but ceremonial work and fundamental activity that assisted to preserve cosmic structure and guarantee Dumuzi's eventual emergence. Inanna possessed sanctuaries in cities throughout Sumer and subsequently in Akkadian and Babylonian territories. Zabalam was an ancient and significant worship center, so strongly connected with Inanna that the city's designation was occasionally inscribed with signs signifying Inanna and sanctuary. She possessed sanctuaries in Nippur, where she was connected with the central shrine of Sumerian religion. She possessed sanctuaries in Ur, where her high priestess Enheduanna functioned, in Lagash, in Shurupak, in Kish, in Adab, in virtually every notable city. Inanna, or her subsequent manifestation, Ishtar, commanded worship and obtained offerings. When the Akkadian Empire unified Mesopotamia under Sargon and his descendants, Inanna's worship assumed even greater significance. Sargon credited his triumphs directly to Inanna's patronage. His grandson Naram-Sin constructed a sanctuary to Inanna in the city of Akkad itself, the imperial capital. The goddess became connected with imperial authority and conquest. Her warlike dimension emphasized to justify military expansion. Under Assyrian governance, centuries subsequently, Ishtar reached perhaps her highest standing. The Assyrians elevated her above even their own national god, Ashur, rendering her the supreme deity of their empire. Ishtar of Nineveh and Ishtar of Arbela were treated as distinct manifestations of the goddess, each with her own sanctuary and worship. Assyrian monarchs asserted to govern with her mandate, portraying themselves as her favorites, crediting their triumphs to her support. The architecture of Ishtar's sanctuaries in the Neo-Assyrian period featured monumental entrances guarded by protective spirits, walls decorated with her emblems, the eight-pointed star and the lion, and elaborate ceremonial spaces for offerings and ceremonies. These were not humble locations of worship, but palaces for a sovereign, structures that proclaimed divine authority and royal devotion. The worship of Inanna Ishtar persisted for millennia, adapting to shifting governmental circumstances and transforming theological structures, but never entirely losing its fundamental temperament. Through the ascension and decline of kingdoms, through conquests and cultural metamorphoses, through the transformation from Sumerian to Akkadian to Babylonian to Assyrian civilizations, the goddess remained a constant manifestation, her sanctuaries preserved, her observances honored, her authority acknowledged. But nothing endures forever, not even the worships of supreme goddesses. The ascension of monotheistic religions, especially Judaism and subsequently Christianity, delivered new religious structures that possessed no location for the multiplicity of deities that had distinguished Mesopotamian religion. The final cuneiform documents mentioning Ishtar extend to the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era. By the 6th century of the Common Era, her worship had effectively ceased, her sanctuaries abandoned or converted to other objectives, her ceremonies forgotten. Yet in those thousands of years of active worship, countless individuals had discovered meaning, hope, and association through devotion to Inanna. Cultivators had petitioned her for abundant plots, warriors had pursued her patronage in combat, lovers had summoned her favor on their couplings, monarchs had asserted her as their divine spouse, priestesses had functioned for her with commitments spanning entire lifetimes. The sanctuaries had stood as anchors of metropolitan civilization, commercial centers, spiritual refuges, locations where heaven and earth converged. To stand in the ruins of Uruk today, to witness the eroded remnants of the supreme sanctuary complex, is to glimpse both the splendor of what existed and the inevitability of transformation. The dwelling of heaven has collapsed. The sovereign no longer obtains her offerings. The hymns are silent, but the memory remains, preserved in clay tablets buried in the ruins, in the literature that survived through copying and recopying, in the influence she possessed on other goddesses and gods who arrived after. Inanna's sanctuaries are absent, but her chronicle endures. From Sumer to Babylon, the metamorphosis of the sovereign. The chronicle of Inanna doesn't conclude with the decline of Sumerian civilization. Instead, it metamorphoses, adapts, and persists under new designations and in new manifestations as the cultural landscape of Mesopotamia transforms from Sumerian to Akkadian to Babylonian to Assyrian dominance. This metamorphosis discloses both the resilience of religious tradition and the manners in which deities are reshaped to function the requirements of shifting societies. To comprehend the complete scope of Inanna's legacy, we must follow her expedition through these cultural transformations and perceive how the sovereign of heaven became Ishtar, how she influenced goddesses far beyond Mesopotamia, and how her worship ultimately arrived at a conclusion. The essential moment in this metamorphosis arrived during the reign of Sargon of Akkad, who governed from approximately 2334 to 2279 before the Common Era. Sargon generated the first empire in Mesopotamian chronology, unifying the previously autonomous Sumerian city-states and the Akkadian-speaking territories of the north under a singular governance. This governmental unification necessitated religious reconciliation, a method to deliver together the different assemblies and different traditions of worship that had developed in separate cities and cultures. Sargon's solution was syncretism, the identification of deities from different traditions with one another based on their similar characteristics or territories. The Sumerian goddess Inanna was merged with the Akkadian goddess Ishtar. Whether Ishtar was originally a separate deity from the Syrian territory, or whether she was the Akkadian interpretation of Inanna from the beginning, remains disputed among researchers. What's evident is that by Sargon's era, and certainly through the work of his offspring, Enki, Inanna, and Ishtar had become effectively the identical deity, designated by different names in different languages. The designation Ishtar itself appears to originate from earlier manifestations like Ashtar or Ashtart, linking to a broader family of Near Eastern goddesses, including the Phoenician Astarte and the Canaanite Asherah. This linguistic association suggests that goddesses of affection and conflict were pervasive in the ancient Near East, and that the figure we recognize as Inanna Ishtar was component of a larger pattern of goddess worship that transcended individual cultures. Under Akkadian governance, particular dimensions of Inanna's temperament became more pronounced. Her connection with conflict and conquest was emphasized as the empire expanded through military energy. Sargon explicitly credited his triumphs to Inanna's patronage, and his offspring, Enki, composed formidable hymns honoring the goddess's frightening authority in combat. One of Enkiduanna's compositions, The Exaltation of Inanna, dramatically depicts the goddess as the supreme deity whose wrath none can resist. Enkiduanna herself represents the continuity and metamorphosis of Inanna's worship. As a Sumerian high priestess functioning as an Akkadian monarch's offspring, inscribing in Sumerian about a goddess increasingly designated by her Akkadian name, Enkiduanna embodied the cultural synthesis that Sargon's empire necessitated. Her poetry accomplished something extraordinary, generating a unified vision of the goddess that functioned across linguistic and cultural limits, rendering Inanna acceptable to both Sumerian traditionalists and Akkadian newcomers. The consecrated matrimony ceremony persisted under Akkadian governance, with Akkadian monarchs asserting to be the spouse of Ishtar, just as Sumerian monarchs had asserted to be the spouse of Inanna. The ceremony's governmental dimensions became even more significant as the empire expanded. To be recognized as Ishtar's spouse was to possess a claim to imperial authorization that transcended regional allegiances. It was a method of declaring that divine patronage, not mere military conquest, justified the monarch's governance over diverse populations. When the Akkadian Empire ultimately collapsed around 2154 before the Common Era, the worship of Inanna Ishtar persisted through the subsequent periods. The third dynasty of Ur, which reunified much of the territory under Sumerian governance, around 2112 before the Common Era, witnessed a flowering of devotion to Inanna. Numerous of the love compositions honoring her connection with Dumuzi extend to this period. The consecrated matrimony was practiced with especially elaborate detail, with comprehensive hymns portraying the ceremony in manners that grant us our clearest portrait of how it actually operated. But as duration elapsed, the equilibrium transformed increasingly toward the Akkadian designation and the Akkadian cultural structure. Sumerian ceased to be a spoken language sometime around 2000 before the Common Era, though it persisted to be employed as a literary and liturgical language, like Latin in medieval Europe. As Sumerian declined, so did the distinctly Sumerian dimensions of the goddess's worship. Inanna became Ishtar, and though the two were interpreted as the identical deity, Ishtar assumed characteristics and connections that reflected Babylonian and Assyrian rather than Sumerian culture. In Babylonian religion, Ishtar became component of a restructured assembly. She was the offspring of the lunar god Sin, the Akkadian manifestation of Nanna, rendering her genealogy uniform with older Sumerian tradition. But she was also increasingly paired with Marduk, the ascending national god of Babylon. While Ishtar never became merely a consort or subordinate to Marduk, her worship in Babylon had to accommodate itself to the developing significance of the male celestial god. The celestial dimension of Ishtar became even more prominent in Babylonian astronomy and astrology. As Venus, She was among the planets whose trajectories were meticulously observed and documented. The Babylonians developed advanced mathematical models to anticipate Venus's manifestations and disappearances, comprehending that the morning and evening celestial body were the identical entity. These astronomical observations influenced back into religious comprehension, with Ishtar's trajectories through the heavens interpreted as possessing omens and interpretations for terrestrial occurrences. Under Assyrian governance, commencing around 1365 before the Common Era, and reaching its apex between 911 and 609 before the Common Era, Ishtar attained perhaps her most magnificent prominence. The Assyrians rendered her their supreme deity, elevating her above their own national god, Ashur. This was an exceptional development. The majority of ancient populations positioned their national god at the summit of the assembly, but the Assyrians evidently discovered in Ishtar something that addressed their imperial drives and their military culture. Assyrian monarchs characterized themselves as the favorites of Ishtar of Nineveh and Ishtar of Arbela, treating these as distinct manifestations of the goddess, each with her own sanctuary and her own worship. Royal records portray the monarchs consulting Ishtar before confrontations, obtaining oracles from her priestesses, crediting their triumphs to her direct intervention. She was depicted in Assyrian art as a warrior goddess par excellence, armed with bow and arrows, positioned on the backs of lions, radiating authority and terror. The Assyrians also preserved Ishtar's association to intimacy and affection, but this dimension appears to have been somewhat subordinated to her martial character in official royal ideology. The empire required a war goddess more than an affection goddess, and Ishtar obliged, or rather her priests and theologians reshaped her image to function imperial requirements. Yet the earlier traditions never entirely vanished. Love poetry persisted to be inscribed, consecrated matrimony ceremonies persisted to be executed, and her sanctuaries persisted to employ priestesses whose service possessed intimate dimensions. Beyond Mesopotamia proper, Ishtar's influence extended widely through the ancient Near East. The Phoenician goddess Astarte, worshipped throughout the Levant and the Mediterranean realm, was directly influenced by and conceivably originated from Ishtar. The Hebrew Bible mentions Ashtoreth, unmistakably the identical goddess, as among the foreign deities that certain Israelites worshipped despite the prophet's condemnations. The worship of Astarte included consecrated prostitution and abundance ceremonies that closely paralleled Mesopotamian practices. In the Hittite domain, Ishtar was identified with or influenced the goddess Shaushka, who, like Ishtar, administered both affection and conflict. In Egypt, during periods of Mesopotamian influence, Ishtar emerged in religious documents and mystical spells. The goddess was extraordinarily adaptable, capable of crossing cultural limits while preserving her fundamental temperament. Perhaps most notably, Ishtar influenced the Greek goddess Aphrodite. While Aphrodite possessed indigenous Greek origins, her connection with intimacy, her origin narratives, and particular dimensions of her worship demonstrate evident Mesopotamian influence that arrived through Phoenician intermediaries. The chronicle in Homer's Iliad of Aphrodite, being wounded in combat and fleeing to complain to her father, Zeus, extraordinarily parallels Ishtar's conduct in the Epic of Gilgamesh, indicating that particular narratives travelled along with the general goddess archetype. But by the first millennium of the Common Era, essential transformations were metamorphosing the religious landscape of the ancient Near East. Monotheistic religions, first Judaism, then Christianity and Islam, were extending, delivering with them a rejection of polytheism and especially a suspicion of goddesses. The goddess worship that had been so central to ancient Near Eastern religion for thousands of years arrived to be perceived as false idolatry, as the worship of demons masquerading as deities. The final datable cuneiform tablets that mention Ishtar originate from the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era. By this duration, traditional Mesopotamian religion was in serious decline, compressed between the competing attractions of Hellenistic culture, Zoroastrian dualism, and Christian monotheism. The ancient sanctuaries were collapsing into ruin. The priesthoods were perishing. The ceremonies were being forgotten. When Christianity became the predominant religion of the Roman and subsequently Byzantine empires, the remaining vestiges of goddess worship were actively suppressed. By around 600 of the Common Era, the worship of Ishtar had effectively ceased. The sanctuaries were abandoned, converted to churches, or quarried for construction materials. The hymns were no longer sung. The observances were no longer honoured. The goddess who had been worshipped for more than 3,000 years, who had commanded the devotion of millions of individuals, who had moulded the religion, literature, and culture of one of humanity's supreme civilizations, had fallen silent. Yet in a peculiar manner, Ishtar never entirely vanished. Folk traditions preserved memories, frequently garbled and misinterpreted, of the goddess. Medieval Christian researchers knew of her through references in the Bible, though they interpreted her as a demon. Her influence on Aphrodite signified that dimensions of her temperament persisted in Greek and Roman mythology. Contemporary archaeology and the decipherment of cuneiform inscription in the 19th century delivered her back from mortality, so to speak, disclosing her narratives and her worship in extraordinary detail. Today, Inanna Ishtar has become a figure of fascination for researchers, feminists, and spiritual seekers. She represents a formidable feminine divinity from an era before the dominance of male celestial gods, a goddess who was intimate but not maternal, warlike but not simply destructive, autonomous and intricate, and utterly undomesticated. Academic volumes and articles analyze her narratives from every conceivable perspective: psychological, governmental, historical, astronomical, neo-pagan, and goddess spirituality movements have adopted her as an emblem of feminine authority and autonomy. In literature and popular culture, Inanna emerges as a character in fantasy novels, is referenced in poetry, and inspires artistic representations. She has become, in a sense, immortal in a manner her ancient worship never quite attained. They preserved her worship alive for 3,000 years through ceremony and petition. We preserve her memory alive through scholarship and imagination, discovering in her ancient chronicles reflections of eternal human concerns, questions about affection and mortality, authority and longing, the connection between mortals and divine energies that remain relevant today. The metamorphosis from Inanna to Ishtar to Astarte to Aphrodite to contemporary reimagining demonstrates to us something significant about how religious traditions transform. Gods and goddesses are not fixed, unchanging beings. They are living cultural energies that adapt to the requirements and comprehensions of the populations who worship or remember them. Inanna transformed dramatically from her most ancient manifestations in the Uruk period to her final manifestations in the late Babylonian period. Yet something fundamental remained constant: a fierce autonomy, a refusal to be restricted to any singular classification, an intricacy that resisted simplification. Conclusion: the eternal sovereign. So we've travelled through more than 3,000 years of chronology, from the most ancient sanctuaries of Uruk to the final decline of Mesopotamian religion, following the path of a goddess who defied every endeavour to classify or contain her. We've witnessed Inanna as the astute deceiver who appropriated the me from Enki, as the audacious adventurer who descended to the netherworld and emerged as the fervent lover of Dumuzi, as the vengeful deity who dispatched the bull of heaven against Gilgamesh, as the guardian of cities and monarchs, as the sovereign of heaven whose sanctuaries dotted the Mesopotamian landscape. What can we conclude about this extraordinary figure? Perhaps the most significant observation is that Inanna embodies contradictions not as flaws but as essential truths about being. She is the goddess of affection and the goddess of conflict, because affection and conflict are both manifestations of intensity, both entail the violation of ordinary limits, both necessitate the bravery to hazard everything. She delivers abundance and she delivers devastation, because existence and mortality are inseparable, because generation and obliteration are two faces of the identical cosmic energy. The ancient Mesopotamians comprehended something that contemporary thought frequently struggles with: that reality is not binary, that virtue and wickedness, illumination and shadow, generation and obliteration exist not as separate contrasts, but as intertwined dimensions of an intricate whole. Inanna was never simplified into a safe, comfortable figure. She remained hazardous, volatile, capable of both favour and curse, and her worshippers didn't perceive this as a problem, but rather as reflecting the authentic character of the divine and of being itself. Inanna's legacy extends far beyond the ancient realm that generated her. She influenced countless other goddesses, from Astarte to Aphrodite. Her narratives supplied archetypes that emerged throughout world literature: the descent into shadow and emergence, the dying and rising god, the consecrated matrimony. Her chronicle of obtaining the me influenced notions about how culture and civilization emerge. Her descent to the netherworld became a template for comprehending mortality and rebirth. In contemporary eras, Inanna has become a figure of especially significant interest for those studying gender, intimacy, and authority. Her worship employed gender-variant individuals in respected positions. Her consecrated prostitutes defied the dichotomy between consecrated and intimate. Her refusal to be characterized as wife or mother, her assertion of intimate autonomy, her wielding of both traditionally feminine and traditionally masculine authorities. All of this addresses contemporary discussions about gender fluidity and the social construction of gender positions. Researchers have also discovered in Inanna's narratives rich material for psychological interpretation. The Jungian analyst Sylvia Brinton Pereira inscribed influentially about Inanna's descent as an expedition of the feminine psyche into the netherworld of the unconscious, an encounter with the shadow self represented by Ereshkigal, and an emergence that integrates illumination and shadow, conscious and unconscious. While such interpretations hazard anachronism, applying contemporary psychological concepts to ancient narratives, they also demonstrate the continued relevance of these chronicles. Feminist researchers have been especially drawn to Inanna as an example of formidable feminine divinity from before the development of patriarchal monotheism. They perceive in her worship evidence of a duration when women held notable religious authorization, when intimacy was honored rather than restricted, when the goddess was not merely the consort of the god, but a supreme authority in her own capacity. This has led to the adoption of Inanna in various manifestations of goddess spirituality and neo-pagan practice. Yet we must be cautious not to project our own longings and ideologies onto the ancient past. The worship of Inanna existed within societies that were profoundly hierarchical, where slavery was acknowledged, where women's entitlements were restricted in numerous manners, despite the authority of individual priestesses. Inanna herself, for all her authority and autonomy, existed within a patriarchal assembly where male gods like An, Enlil, and Enki held ultimate authorization in the majority of theological structures. The consecrated matrimony, while granting priestesses significant positions, also functioned to legitimize male monarchy. Still, there's no denying that Inanna represents something exceptional, a divine feminine figure of genuine authority and intricacy who commanded worship for millennia. The hymns inscribed to her, especially those by Enheduanna, are among humanity's most ancient literary works. Her narratives are discovered in some of our oldest surviving documents. She was present at the very inception of civilization, as cities were forming, as inscription was being invented, as humanity was executing the essential transformation from villages to metropolitan existence. And perhaps that's why Inanna matters even now, thousands of years after her worship ceased. She reminds us of the antiquity and intricacy of human religious imagination. She demonstrates to us that our ancestors generated deities as intricate and multifaceted as any contemporary literary character. She demonstrates that notions we might conceive of as contemporary, like the fluidity of gender or the integration of intimacy and spirituality, possess ancient precedents. The sovereign of heaven is silent now. Her sanctuaries are ruins. Her priestesses are dust. The consecrated matrimony is not honored. Dumuzi is not mourned. The me have been scattered and lost. Yet in the clay tablets buried in the ruins, in the narratives preserved through millennia of copying, in the scholarly volumes and articles analyzing her worship, in the artistic representations inspired by her image, in the conversations about her significance, Inanna endures. She endures not as a living goddess obtaining worship, but as a cultural memory, an archaeological treasure, a literary figure, an emblem, an inspiration. She endures because her chronicles still address us across the vast gulf of duration. We comprehend Inanna's longing to obtain the me, to become more than what others have designated her to be. We comprehend her readiness to descend into shadow, to confront mortality itself, to hazard everything for metamorphosis. We comprehend her wrath when scorned, her affection that bordered on obsession, her intricacy that defied simplification. The ancient Mesopotamians are absent, their languages are deceased, their cities are buried in sand. Their gods no longer obtain offerings, but they granted us their chronicles, inscribed in clay that survived the collapse of empires, the passage of millennia, the transformation from their realm to ours. And among those chronicles, the narratives of Inanna shine brightest, granting us a portrait of a goddess, and through her, a window into the minds and hearts of the populations who generated one of humanity's first supreme civilizations. If you've appreciated this expedition through the existence and eras of the Sovereign of Heaven, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support renders it achievable to persist exploring the deep chronology of human belief, to unearth these ancient chronicles and render them accessible to contemporary audiences. Share your reflections in the comments. Inform me what dimension of Inanna's mythology resonates most with you. Let me know what other ancient deities or narratives you'd desire to explore. From the sanctuaries of Uruk to the digital age, from clay tablets to computer screens, the chronicles endure. The Sovereign of Heaven lives on, not in belief but in memory, not in worship but in wonder. And perhaps that's sufficient. Perhaps that's the most authentic manifestation of immortality any deity can attain. To be remembered, to be studied, to be reimagined for each new generation, to remain forever fascinating, forever intricate, forever the Sovereign of heaven and earth. Thank you for joining me on this expedition. Until next occasion, keep exploring the deep past, keep inquiring questions, and keep discovering meaning in the chronicles that our ancestors granted us. The ancients may be absent, but their voices still echo through the ages, if only we take the duration to listen.